In this video, you'll discover the 5 things the top 1% of podcasts do to grow and monetize as fast as possible. Look, here's a reality. Most podcasters never grow or make money from their podcast. And this sucks because you've been putting in a ton of work for years, creating better content, upgrading your production, and posting everywhere that you can. But growth just isn't happening. And it's frustrating because you're doing everything they say you should do. But here's the thing. It's not your fault. Nobody tells you how to create a podcast marketing strategy. They just throw generic advice at you like post more, be consistent, and repurpose your content, which of course are all the things you're already doing that isn't working to help you grow and monetize your show. And that's why so many podcasts fail to grow and monetize. It's not about better content, fancy production, posting more on social media. Again, you most likely have all those things. But none of these things will actually work if you don't have a clear strategy in place. Because when you don't have a clear roadmap, you end up spinning your wheels, hoping that something finally clicks. But the top 1% of podcasts, they're not guessing, they have a strategy. And once you do too, everything can change. So look, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com, a company helping entrepreneurs and experts of podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI podcast for their business. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm also the best-selling authors of the book that you've seen here under the pen name of Daniel Larson. I'm also the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which has generated $120,000 in profit in the last 9 months for our own business. And look, like I mentioned, the biggest entrepreneurs who create content like Pat Flynn, Alex Hormozy, Amy Porterfield, or Stephen Bartlett, they aren't winging it. They aren't just guessing that things will magically work out. They're not just hoping that growth will happen randomly. They are following a proven system to grow and monetize their podcast, to get an ROI for the time and effort they've invested into their shows. If not, it's simply not worth their time. And that's how they got to the top. And if you want to grow your podcast, build a loyal audience, sell more books, courses, coaches, or attract high-ticket clients or high-ticket, paying sponsors for your podcast, you too need to follow a growth and monetization system. And that's why in this video, I want to show you 5 things the top 1% of podcasts are doing that 99% ignore. So let's dive in. Number 1, they know exactly who they want to attract with their podcast. Most podcasters make the mistake of trying to reach everyone. But when they try to reach everyone, they end up reaching no one. And I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, but it's so true. If you're not clear on who you want to attract with your podcast, growth becomes 10 times harder. You don't have a target, so your messaging and promotion on social media will always fall flat. And that's why your podcast isn't growing. If your show name, episode title, show description, content strategy, guest selection, keywords you're trying to rank for, your show notes and your cover art, if all of those aspects of your show aren't optimized to serve a specific listener, how can you be surprised when no one listens, engages, or follows your CTAs? Imagine opening a restaurant with no sign, no menu, no clear cuisine in terms of what you actually offer. How the hell can you be surprised when no one walks in? And we see this all the time with podcasts. And I mentioned it's not your fault. Like most of the time you start a podcast because either someone else has mentioned how I think you'd be great for a podcast, or you start a podcast because you see other people doing a podcast and you think you could do the same thing. Or maybe you have a dream of sharing your message and using the podcast as a client acquisition machine for your business. But these are some of the fundamentals that are often looked over, that the top 1% of podcasts absolutely sweat. I mentioned the top 1% of podcasts know exactly who their ideal listeners are, and every decision from branding to content speaks directly to them. Here's the thing, they're not working any harder than you. They're just working intentionally. They are laser focused on specific actions that drive growth and monetization for their podcast over scattered chaos, which is what 99% of podcasts end up doing. And that's why their shows explode while others stay stuck. And you can too. Now, once you know who you want to reach, you can then present your show in a way that's widely attractive to those listeners. This is the first step in convincing a stranger who doesn't know you to click and listen to your podcast. Now look, there are hundreds of thousands of other podcasts out there. And the thing is, someone is probably doing something similar to you. So the question becomes, what makes you different? We call this your USP. So for our clients, we make sure they have a USP. What makes your show distinctly different from other podcasts out there who you're competing against? Because whether we like it or not, we're competing for attention to some degree. I'm competing against my competitors to get your attention, to help you grow your podcast and monetize. The same for you in the industry that you're in. Then once you understand what your USP is, what your unique selling point is, there's is then highlighting your unique angle in your show name, in your show description, in your cover art, in your episode titles. When you do this, you're presenting your show, right? Because these areas I've just broken down, these are all the areas a new listener or an old listener that they see first initially before they decide to click play and listen to your podcast, before they can even become a super fan, before they can even become a client for your business. You need to present your show in a way that attracts them. And when you do this, you instantly stand out. Your social media promotions gains way more traction because you have a unique proposition for your show. It's not just noise like everyone else. It's not like a classic interview-based podcast, right? And you know exactly what topics will attract new listeners for your podcast. But more importantly, because you have a one-of-a-kind show that's truly unique, you keep more listeners coming back for more because they can't find your content somewhere else. And that all sounds great, and everyone says that, but what does it actually mean for you? So I want to give you a real-life example of a past client of ours. So this client, she was around 2,000 monthly downloads, incredible podcaster, great host, been doing it for a couple of years now. And she was just kind of, again, stuck with slow and steady growth. Her growth was sometimes growth, sometimes decline, but it's kind of like plateauing essentially. And when we looked at her show was about communication skills and effective communication for executives, right? We looked at a show and then we looked at competition. We looked at the market. What's everyone else doing? And it turns out everyone else is doing a generic podcast around interviewing executives or, you know, people in leadership roles and just having a conversation. That's a normal format for a podcast, an interview-based show. The issue with that is if you're not the number one in that space, why should someone listen to your podcast over the person who's quite literally the number one, the best person in that niche? So for her, we had to create a unique angle. And what we decided to do for her podcast, instead of just the traditional interview-based shows, we added on top of that, where she'd have a segment, where she'd have a 10-minute case study episode breaking down the characteristics and traits of A-list celebrities that made them charismatic leaders, that helped them build influence, that helped them become great communicators. She broke that down into, again, bite-sized mini case study episodes. And now her show is totally unique, something that no one ever knew about. Now, there's other little things that we did to make sure that she really stood out, but those were the fundamental changes and shift that we made that helped her show become something that's new, that's wildly attractive to the listeners she wanted to reach. For you, it will be something different, and you have to find that unique angle. And by the way, that client then went, on to grow to like 23,000 monthly downloads. I think she's crossed 23,000 monthly downloads within a span of 8 months of us working together. And she's still working with us day in and day out. And now we're working on turning her listeners into high-ticket clients, and it's going phenomenally well. So that's really it. So the second thing that the top 1% of podcasts do that most podcasters ignore is they focus on a retention system that keeps listeners coming back for more. Now, this is going to sound out there and a bit absurd, but most podcasters are honestly way too focused on getting new listeners to their show that they ignore the bigger problem. The likelihood is you're already promoting, you're already getting tons of exposure onto your show. Now, would more exposure help? Yeah, sure, I'm sure it would do. But only if you have a retention system in place, meaning you're focused on keeping listeners coming back for future content. Because believe it or not, it's impossible for you to grow your listenership and grow month after month after month after month if you don't increase the number of listeners who become super fans of your show, if you don't increase the number of listeners who come back for more. And good luck turning listeners into client or getting listeners to take action if they haven't built the like, know, and trust by consuming tons of your content. If you're a business owner, you need to build the like, know, and trust. You need people coming back for more. You need your listeners to be nurtured by your content. If not, this is a big problem. Now, what most podcasters say to me at this point is, look, Ant, I get it, that makes total sense, but dude, that's not my problem, right? And you might be thinking the same thing. You might be thinking, hey, that's not my problem because my numbers each month are consistent. I'm either at 2,000 monthly downloads every single month or 5,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 every single month, so that's not my problem. I have listeners who come back for more over and over again. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's a percentage of your audience who are coming back for more. But I can guarantee that you're losing so many of the listeners who try out your show for the first time. Because think about it. Just because you're at 2,000 monthly downloads and you're just stuck there, as an example, you're stuck at 2,000 monthly downloads every single month, you might think, oh, that's great, I'm keeping listeners coming back for more, I need new listeners. When in actuality, what if it just means you're gaining listeners and losing listeners at exact same rate? It's kind of like pouring, water into a leaky bucket. You keep adding more and more and more, but you're never actually filling it up. More water gets added, but more leaks out. and it's a filtration system that keeps you at the exact same spot, the 2,000 monthly downloads, right? The same thing happens for your podcast. Look, here's how massive shows fix that. Number one, they nail the format. And for you, you need to nail your format. So keep it consistent and predictable. Listeners should know what to expect every single episode. Next, hook them in the first 60 seconds. If your intro is too long or boring, people will leave, because retention equals growth. Look at it. If you have 100 people who find your show, but only 5 of them stick around, your growth is dead on arrival. So you need to convince this new listener within 60 seconds why your podcast is worth listening to. Have a strong CTA. So always tell listeners what to do next, whether that's subscribe, whether that's follow, whether that's listening to another episode. That's a great way to keep them in the loop and to keep binging your content. Have irresistible episode titles. That I really should say have irresistible episode titles, but you get the gist, right? The top 1% of shows, they sweat their titles because they know it's one of the only things new and old listeners use to decide whether or not whether or not to listen to an episode or to ignore it. And then finally, they build an ecosystem around their podcast. They capture the listeners' details to keep them engaged in between episodes, so they remain top of mind. So let's say you're uploading once a week. In between that time, how are you keeping your listeners engaged? How are you keeping their attention? How are you remaining top of mind so when the new episode comes out, they're eager to listen? An email list is an effective way to do that. And it also means they can target them when a new episode arrives. Once again, keeping those listeners coming back for more. Now, the thing is, all of these things are fantastic. They're great and they absolutely work. But this is great for a more tactical level. But I want to take things a bit further. I want to ask you the question of like, hey, look, fundamentally, what needs to happen for you to keep more of your listeners coming back for more? And the truth is, it's way more intuitive and basic, and it's going to sound so obvious, disgustingly obvious, yet so many of us screw this up. I've definitely screwed this up at certain times, and when I lose track of this and lose sight of this, my show declines or it stops growing. And I see the exact same thing happen to the clients that we work with in the Get More Listeners Academy. So look, simply put, to keep listeners coming back for more, they create binge-worthy content. But how do you do this, right? They do this by making every single episode highly targeted and relevant to the specific listener they want to reach. That way, every single episode is made with that listener in mind, with their pain points, their desires, their needs, what they actually care about. It's a focused strategy that puts the listener's needs, wants, and desires over their own. It gets to a certain point where you're just talking about things that you want to talk about isn't going to take you to that next level. It gets to a point where the show is no longer about you and more about the listeners you want to serve. It gets to a point that if you want to grow and attract the right listener, you need to have crystal clarity around the exact listener you're trying to reach. If not, like I said in number one, how are you going to be annoyed if you're not reaching more listeners if you don't know the listeners you want to reach? How are you going to keep listeners coming back for more if you're constantly thinking about what you want? That's a show for you. That's not a show for your listeners. So how will people gravitate around that? Their show is out there to serve the audience they want to attract. And to attract that audience, they have to cover the specific content that audience wants to listen to. They do this on a consistent basis and then add all the fancy bells and whistles I mentioned before. This is the fundamental shift that you need to make in order to ensure you attract more listeners every single time. Now, if you have an interview-based show with a generic broad, it's very hard to keep listeners coming back for more because you're covering a bunch of different topics that, all could relate to that individual, but might not be top of mind for them. For example, if you're interviewing a bunch of millionaires, but your audience, your core audience, are actually stuck below $10,000 per month, well, guess what? The content is great and it's nice, but you're not going to have a thriving, highly hyper-engaged audience because it's too high level for them. They're not there just yet. Every single episode isn't relevant to them and they could easily skip one. It's great for inspiration and other people can do that. But if you want to grow fast and monetize, you have to become way more specific. And then that leads us to the third thing that the top 1% of podcasts do that most podcasters completely ignore. Number 3, they leverage podcast SEO to attract free listeners. So most podcasters, how they try to grow and get exposure for their show is by promoting on social media. And it makes sense, right? Everyone's on social media. It seems to be a great place to kind of promote. Everyone's doing it, so why shouldn't you? The issue is that social media is a great way to keep your listeners engaged, but it's a terrible way to grow your podcast audience because the people you're promoting to on social media, they see your content, they already know your podcast exists, They are either a listener or they're not. And if your social media audience aren't growing rapidly, you eventually hit a cap of the number of people who you can turn into listeners. That's just how it is. You have 1,000 followers. If all 1,000 of them become a listener and you have no more followers, how will your podcast grow? And the other thing as well, that's even more fundamental, most people aren't going on to social media to discover new podcasts to listen to. They might love a clip, you might love a clip, I might love a clip, but it doesn't mean I'm going to stick around for a 60-minute long episode. It just means I found a clip that I love and I might share that with someone. Doesn't mean I've listened to the episode. If I ask you, name me 3 podcasts you still listen to today because you discovered them through social media promotions, 99% of people will literally say, like, I can't name 3. I literally can't name 3. Might be able to name 1, maybe 2, but can't name 3. And it's because people aren't going to social media to discover new shows to listen to. So like I said, social media doesn't help you consistently grow and reach a new audience. The top podcasters use podcast SEO to get found by thousands of new listeners every month for free. Podcast SEO is a process of ranking your podcast high on Apple and Spotify. There are 100 million podcast listeners in US alone every single week. Most of them search for podcasts inside Apple and Spotify. Those are the streaming platforms people use to discover new shows to listen to. But if your podcast doesn't show up on search, people can't find you. And that's where podcast SEO comes in. Because you might have the best show on earth, but again, if people are searching for your content and your show isn't optimized to rank higher on Apple and Spotify, where the people are going to discover new shows to listen to, your show is basically invisible. And you're then stuck relying on unreliable strategies like social media to grow your show when you could be tapping into quite literally free traffic. Again, it's free traffic, it's predictable growth, and it compounds over time. Here's how to do it. First, use the right keywords in your show title, your description, and your episode titles. What this will do, i.e. keywords meaning search terms, what search terms would a new listener search in on Apple and Spotify to find your episode or to find your podcast? You want to add that to your show name, your show description, your episode titles, because it indexes your show, means it gives Apple and Spotify the information they need to rank your podcast for the relevant search term. So if someone searches in how to grow a podcast, my podcast should pop up as one of the search results. If you search in how to reduce anxiety, if your podcast is about anxiety, your podcast should pop up. If they type in leadership skills for executives, they should be able to find your podcast. If they can't, that's a problem. It means some people are looking for your content, but they can't find you specifically. And what they do is they find your competitors' shows because your competitors are ranking for the right keywords. So number 2, write detailed show notes with searchable terms. This is going to, again, give Apple and Spotify more information to rank your show for the right keywords and search terms. Number 5, encourage reviews and engagement. So having high engagement on your podcast, i.e., people listen all the way through to the end of your show. People are leaving reviews on your podcast. This sends a positive signal to Apple and Spotify, telling them that your show is relevant for the specific keywords you're trying to rank for. And look, we've literally seen clients who were on the verge of quitting their show. So we had a client called Raven. She was on the verge of quitting her podcast. And this is insane, right? On the verge of quitting her podcast, and she was struggling to grow, posting consistently for years. No matter what she did, her show just wouldn't budge. And again, 2 years in, slow growth, no leads, barely any engagement. And it wasn't until we switched up her podcast and optimized it for podcast SEO that her show quite literally took off. Like, literally took off. She went from 400 monthly downloads to 20,000 plus monthly downloads just by optimizing her show for high discoverability through podcast SEO. So it's not just about growth, right? Because if you're ranking for search terms your audience are looking for, and let's say your audience are looking for a solution to a problem, so they type in, for example, again, leadership skills for executives, and your show is the first show that they see, well, guess what? If you have a coaching program or an offer or a course or a community that's paid, that's all about what? Executives, coaching, leadership. And now someone searching on Apple and Spotify finds your podcast, that's essentially you leveraging podcast SEO as a top of funnel, as a discovery point to your podcast and then into your program. And the best part about this is those are high intent potential clients because they're actively looking for the content you produce. Imagine what that would do for your show. Instead of just promoting on social media, trying to convince random strangers to listen to your podcast, people don't really care. Think about how much easier it would be for you to grow if you had this optimized for yourself. Clients like Todd, he did it. Now he's attracting new clients to his business from his podcast. And that's the power of podcast SEO. Now that leads us to the fourth thing that the top 1% of podcasts do that a majority of podcasts fail to do, which is they have a consistent way of reaching thousands of new listeners every single month. They do this by reaching podcast listeners where podcast listeners are. That's on other people's podcasts. So, small shows stay small and never monetize because they're missing a repeatable system to bring new listeners to their show every single month. Whereas the top 1% of podcasts do this. They leverage other people's audiences, meaning they get featured on other podcasts. They partner with influencers and they cross-promote. They tap into someone else's audience within their niche and they piggyback, they shortcut their way to a bigger stage. The same way when you invite a guest onto your podcast, you interview them, you're introducing your audience to that guest, and that guest is being introduced to your audience. If the audience does a good enough job, they have gained new fans. Those new fans are your listeners, right? But imagine what if we flip the script for you, and imagine if now you're the one who's guesting on other people's podcasts and they have 10,000 downloads per episode, 100,000 downloads per episode, maybe bloody 1 million downloads per episode. Imagine what that would do for your authority, your credibility, your visibility, the growth of your podcast, and your ability to turn their audience into your own, or even to turn their audience into paying clients for yourself. And again, it's by tapping into other people's audiences. And there's different ways you can do this, right? You can either be a guest, that's one way, or you can run a podcast trailer. It's almost like an ad campaign, where it's a 30-second trailer placed on a similar show to bring instant targeted listener. So that show would read an ad on their podcast within the episode, and it would essentially recommend your show to their listeners. Imagine what that would do for you, right? That's one way. Another thing that you can do is actually find, newsletters to sponsor. So let's say, for example, there's a massive newsletter all about leadership and executives, right? If you find someone who has a massive newsletter already, you can simply place ads on their newsletter. So at the bottom, it will literally promote your show to their newsletter subscribers. And again, that's a targeted way to leverage someone else's audience and turn their audience into your own. Now, it's going to be important that you have a clear USP that makes your show stand out. It needs to be a good pitch. Number 2, a content strategy to keep those listeners coming back for more. And number 3, they need to be able to find your show pretty quickly, right? You need to have all of these things in place, and that's how the top shows grow. But if you don't have that, great. You've got a bunch of exposure, but what does that do for you? If you can't keep listeners coming back for more, or if it's really hard to find your show. So it's really important you have all of these pieces in place before you go out there and try to get a bunch of exposure predictably for your podcast. And then finally, they just track what's working and double down. Growth isn't just random, right? The best podcasters track their downloads, their SEO performance, their conversion rates. Did this growth strategy actually work? Okay, I sponsored this newsletter, did I see an average increase in my, downloads per episode? They track what's working, and when they find what's working, they double down relentlessly. When you have a system for bringing in new listeners every month, your podcast stops being a guessing game. And now we're on to the fun part, right? Which is the monetization piece. Now, really, again, the top 1% of podcasts, they monetize their podcast the right way for their show. Now, most podcasters think that monetization equals ads and sponsorship alone, but that's just not the case, right? The top 1% of podcasts do things differently. They turn their listeners into buyers, either by selling their own offer or selling for other people. They essentially have a way to get their audience to buy stuff. And look, because they've already nailed step 1, attracting the right audience, step 2, keeping those listeners engaged and coming back for more, step 3, getting found organically through podcast SEO, step 4, predictably bringing new listeners to their podcast, monetization then becomes way easier. And here are 4 ways to do it, right? There's 4 ways you can monetize. Option number 1, sell your own product and services. Now look, is this the easy way to monetize? The top podcasters build trust and authority at scale, so when they recommend something, the audience actually listens. What this could look like for you, right? This could be coaches selling courses, memberships, or consulting. This could be service providers attracting high-paying clients. This could be authors selling books, entrepreneurs using their podcast as a sales funnel. The point is, loyal listeners equals warm leads. Once you have the right audience plus consistent traffic, selling is effortless. Option number 2, high ticket monetization. So this is really turning your listeners into high ticket clients. This is the number one way that we've used to monetize our podcast and what we encourage our clients and the Get More Listeners Academy to follow, as is the easiest and simplest path to monetizing, turning your audience into high-ticket clients. Now, what I love about this is the fact that you don't need millions of downloads to make serious money from your show. The top 1% sell premium offers like coaching, mastermind, group programs, because the trust is high, so then you can charge way higher. Now, it could be a business consultant selling 5K plus strategy calls, a fitness coach that sells 3K transformation program, a legal expert selling high-end adversary services. Because even with a small engaged audience, that can make you 5 to 6 figures, even 7 figures per year. I've seen it happen, and of course, I've done it for my own podcast as well. So I know it's possible. I've seen other podcasters do it, and I also know it's possible for you. So look, here's an example. We had one of our clients who added $12,000 in profit to her podcast in 30 days by signing high-ticket clients from her podcast. Again, through her show. Her show at this point was under 1,000 monthly downloads. Think about that, 1,000 monthly downloads, and she made $12,000 in profit through her podcast. And our own podcast was generating, $120,000 in profit in the last 9 months with an audience below 5,000 monthly downloads. Most people think that's insane. They don't think that's even possible. I've met podcasters getting millions of downloads that struggle to generate even 5 figures per year. But we're doing it, and our clients are doing it, and loads of podcasters out there are doing it. A small, engaged, highly targeted niche audience that they're looking to serve, and with a clear back-end offer and product they can sell to that audience. Option number 3, which is affiliate marketing and sponsorship. So let's say, for example, you don't have your own product. No problem, right? You can simply monetize by promoting other people's stuff. So what this looks like, it looks like partnering up with a brand that you already use and trust, earning commission by recommending their tools, courses, and software. This is a traditional way that most people would monetize, or running paid promotions for businesses that align to your own. And because, again, you're bringing in traffic on autopilot, thanks to step 3 and step 4, this becomes passive income. The more your audience grows, the more sales you make. Is really that simple when it comes to, the affiliate marketing side of things, right? And then option number 4, you can build a community and monetize it. The top 1% of podcasts don't just build an audience, they really do stress on the importance of building a community. And in a day and age where AI is rampant, where everyone's not too sure if people are human, I'm sometimes not too sure if what I'm seeing online is actually legit or not. I think we've all been there. But in a world where that's all happening, building community now is more important than ever. And how it works is they have a private community that's paid, and they monetize the access to that community. Now, what this looks like, it could be a private membership or Patreon with bonus content. It could be paid school communities. It could be a mastermind where members network and learn together, right? There's a bunch of different ways you can do this. And now here's the principle, right? People will pay to go much deeper if your podcast delivers value. And once you have a system bringing in new listeners every month, your community keeps growing, and so does your revenue. You need to have the right audience, which you spoke about in step 1. You need to have consistent engagement, which is what we spoke about in step 2. And you need to have traffic to your offer, which we spoke about in step 3 and 4. Traffic meaning eyeballs, meaning attention, meaning people actually viewing, listening, consuming the content you produce. If you get this right, monetization, again, becomes way easier. So look, let's get a pulse on what we've covered so far. Most podcasters never grow or make money, not because they aren't working hard enough, but because they're guessing instead of following a proven system. They pour their time into better content, fancy production, and social media, yet their show stays stuck. Meanwhile, the top 1% of podcasts follow a different playbook. They don't hope for growth, they engineer it. And it all starts with one crucial factor: know exactly who you're targeting. If you try to reach everyone, you'll end up reaching no one. Without a clear audience, your podcast is just another show in the noise. The top podcasters position their show strategically, choosing the right name, titles, and content to attract the exact listener they want. And once they do that, growth becomes 10 times easier. But attracting listeners is only one half of the battle. The second half is keeping them coming back for more. That's where the real growth happens. Most podcasters focus on getting new listeners, but ignore the bigger problem that most podcasters face, which is people listen once but never return. And without retention, growth is impossible. The best podcasters create binge-worthy content by structuring episodes strategically, using strong hooks, ensuring every single episode is highly relevant to their audience. When their listeners keep coming back for more, increasing their downloads becomes effortless. But here's the thing, even the best content won't grow if no one can find it. And that's where podcast SEO comes in. Most people find podcasts by searching on Apple and Spotify, not scrolling on social media. The top podcasters rank higher by optimizing their title, their show description, their show notes with the right keywords. This brings in consistently free listeners every month without spending money on ad, paid promotion, or wasting time on social media. Once they have that organic growth, they then take things one step further. Here's what I mean. The fastest growing shows don't sit back and hope for exposure. They actively bring listeners to their podcast every single month. They guest on other people's podcasts for the spotlight and to build their authority. They run strategic trailer ads on other people's show, and they build engaged communities. Growth isn't random, it's repeatable once you have the right system to tap into a new audience, which leads to the final step, turning listeners into revenue. Most podcasts assume monetization equals ads, but the top 1% focus on selling, whether it's their own product, high-ticket services, affiliate offers, or memberships, because they've already built the right audience, so monetization becomes effortless. The bottom line is this: your podcast isn't a show, it's a platform that can build your personal brand, attract dream clients and business opportunities to your business, change the way people think, and give you true financial freedom. Your podcast can change everything, but only if you take it seriously. Now, the sad thing is, most podcasters never unlock the full potential of their show, right? For most podcasters, monetization feels like a distant dream, something that only happens to big creators, but not them. But that's a lie. You don't need millions of downloads, and you don't need to sell out to sponsors if you don't want to. You just need the right audience, the right positioning, and the right system to turn listeners into buyers. It's not magic, it's a system, and now you have it as well. So keep going, you've got this. Look, my name is Anthony Wineri, you're absolutely fantastic. And if you like this, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below. I'll speak to you shortly. Peace.